Picture the biggest, most terrifying creature you can imagine. Maybe you went to a T-Rex, maybe a blue whale, maybe something from a movie, a giant, a titan, a monster from mythology with the strength to reshape mountains. Now throw all of that out, because the real giants that once ruled this planet were stranger than any of those. Stranger than the myths, stranger than the movies. Stranger, in some cases, than anything a human mind would naturally invent. When we are going to travel back tonight, not hundreds of years, not thousands, but hundreds of millions of years, to meet the creatures that actually held dominion over this planet long before anything that could be called a human was even a distant evolutionary possibility. These were the true first giants. And I promise you, not one of them looks like what the legends say. The legends say giants were like us, but bigger, more powerful, more majestic, built in our image and scaled up. Titanically human. The fossil record says no. The fossil record says the first giants had dozens of legs or compound eyes the size of your fist, or mouths that could shear through armored bone like paper. The fossil record says the first giants lived in atmospheres we couldn't breathe, on landscapes we wouldn't recognize, in ecological systems so alien that even our best scientific imagination struggles to reconstruct them. The truth is always stranger than the myth. Tonight, we're going to prove it. Across every culture on Earth, the oldest stories share a common thread. Giants. Not metaphorical giants, literal ones. Enormous, powerful, humanoid beings who walk the earth before us. Before recorded history, before civilization, maybe even before time as we understand it, the Norse had the Jotnar, frost giants and fire giants who predated the gods themselves. The Greeks had the Titans and the Gigantes, children of the earth who challenged heaven. The Hebrew tradition gave us the Nephilim, the sons of God, who took human wives and produced offspring of terrible size and power. Hindu mythology described the Asuras, primordial giants who warred with the gods for dominion over existence. Indigenous traditions across North America, Polynesia, and Sub-Saharan Africa have their own versions. Enormous ancient beings who shaped the landscape, moved mountains, and vanished before the world became what it is now. These stories are not accidents. They reflect something real about human psychology. A deep intuition that the world was not always as it is now, that the past held forces and scales beyond what the present can offer. That intuition is correct. The world was not always as it is now. The past did hold creatures of a scale that dwarfs anything alive today. The myths are pointing at something true. They just got the details spectacularly wrong. The real giants weren't humanoid. They weren't even vertebrates for the most part, for the longest stretches of time when giants dominated the earth. They were arthropods, joint-limbed creatures with exoskeletons and compound eyes. They were bizarre proto-mammals with saber teeth and sprawling postures. They were armored fish with hydraulically powered jaws. They were insects with wingspans wider than a hawk's. Tonight's video is about those creatures, the real ones, the ones the myths were almost unknowingly reaching toward without having the fossil record to guide them. We're going to meet them in order, understand the world they lived in, understand why they got so impossibly large, and understand what ended them. And at the end, you're going to understand something the mythmakers never could. That the truth of Earth's prehistoric giants is more awe-inspiring, more humbling, and more genuinely terrifying than any legend ever written. Let's go. starting about 440 million years ago. In the sea, the myth of the first people, what the legends got wrong. Before we get to the real giants, let's deal honestly with the myths, because they deserve a proper examination before we set them aside. Not dismissal, but examination. The idea of a lost race of giant humans is one of the most persistent concepts in human mythology and pseudoscience. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a completely understandable human tendency. When ancient people encountered enormous bones eroding out of hillsides and riverbeds, they interpreted them through the conceptual framework they had available. They didn't have paleontology. They didn't have the concept of extinction. They knew what bones looked like, and when they found bones that were enormous, the most logical conclusion available to them, given their worldview, was that enormous beings had once walked the earth. The problem is that the enormous bones they were finding almost never belonged to enormous humans. They belonged to mammoths, mastodons, cave bears, giant ground sloths, and other megafauna that went extinct relatively recently in geological terms. A mammoth's femur, found by someone who has never seen an elephant, looks disturbingly like a giant human leg bone. A mastodon's skull, partially eroded, can look, with some imagination, like the skull of a massive humanoid. The ancient Greeks, finding the bones of prehistoric elephants in the Aegean Islands, may have generated the myth of the Cyclops from the single large nasal cavity in an elephant skull that, if you don't know what you're looking at, resembles a single enormous eye socket. The myths weren't lying. They were doing the best interpretation they could with the evidence they had. The modern version of the giant human claim is less forgivable, maybe because it's operating with full access to the actual science and choosing to ignore it. The viral internet post claiming that the Smithsonian is hiding 8-foot human skeletons, that a conspiracy of scientists is suppressing evidence of a race of ancient giants. These are not honest interpretations of ambiguous evidence. They are fictions, some of them deliberate hoaxes, some of them genuine misidentifications, all of them circulating in a media environment that rewards sensation over accuracy. The fossil record is, as I mentioned in the introduction, ruthless with the truth. It has been examined by thousands of scientists on every continent, in every country, across more than 2 centuries of systematic study. The evidence for a prehistoric race of giant humanoids is zero. There is none. The bones that have been claimed as evidence have, without exception, were turned out to be misidentified animal bones, deliberate fabrications, or the remains of unusually tall but fully human individuals, like the Gravettian skeletons from around 29,000 years ago, some of which reached 6 feet 5 inches, which would have seemed extraordinary to anyone finding them without context. What the fossil record does show, with overwhelming, spectacular, mind-bending clarity, is something far more interesting. Not giant humans, giant everything else. And so let's meet them. The rulers of the ancient sea, Jackalopterus. Our story begins in the water, because before life conquered the land, before there were forests or insects or anything with legs, the seas were already producing giants. It is approximately 390 million years ago, the Devonian period. The land is largely bare. Some primitive plants are just beginning to colonize the edges of continents, but the interior is rock and dust and wind. There are no trees yet. There are no insects. There are certainly no mammals or reptiles or anything we would recognize as a land animal, but the oceans and freshwater environments of the Devonian are teeming with life, and that life is already producing creatures of extraordinary scale. Meet Jecalopterus renunii, a sea scorpion. And when I say sea scorpion, I don't mean something the size of the scorpions you might find in a desert. Jecalopterus was approximately 8.2 feet long, about 2.5 meters, making it the largest arthropod ever to have lived, eclipsing even Arthropleura, which we'll get to shortly. It had the body plan of a scorpion, segmented with a long tail and large frontal claws, but scaled up to the size of a crocodile. The evidence for its size comes from a single fossilized claw fragment found in Germany in 2007, which measured about 18 inches long. By comparing this claw to the proportions of known eurypterid species, researchers calculated the animal's total body length. 18 inches of claw on a scorpion. Let that land. Jecalopterus was a predator, almost certainly a dominant one in its freshwater and brackish water environments. Its large compound eyes suggest it was a visual hunter. Its powerful claws could seize prey. The Devonian seas were full of potential targets: primitive fish, smaller arthropods, early tetrapods, the first creatures beginning to develop limbs adapted for both water and land. The eurypterids, the group to which Jecalopterus belonged, are often called sea scorpions, but many of them lived in freshwater, and some of them may have been capable of brief excursions onto land, using their limbs to drag themselves out of the water the way mudskippers do today. Whether Jecalopterus itself could do this is unknown. But the image of an 8-foot scorpion-like creature hauling itself onto the mudflats of a Devonian riverbank is not one that the mythmakers ever imagined. The eurypterids dominated aquatic ecosystems for over 200 million years, one of the longest reigns of any group of large predators in Earth's history. They would eventually be displaced by the rise of predatory fish, particularly the jaw-bearing fish that evolved during the Devonian itself. But for their time, they were the apex of what life on Earth could produce, and they were doing it before trees existed. The sky opens up. Meganeura in the age of giant insects. Now we move on to land. Specifically, we move into the Carboniferous period, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, and we move into the air. The Carboniferous is one of the most alien periods in Earth's history. The world is warm and wet. Vast, swampy forests cover enormous stretches of the continents. Not forests like we know, but forests of giant club mosses and horsetails and seed ferns, plants so primitive that nothing like them exists today. These forests are pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at a rate that has never been matched before or since. By the mid-Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen reaches approximately 35%, compared to 21% today. This is a world that would literally feel different to breathe in. A world where, if you struck a spark, the vegetation would ignite with terrifying speed. A world where the rules for how large a body can get are fundamentally rewritten. We've already introduced Arthropleura, the giant millipede-like creature that crawled through these forests. But Arthropleura was not alone in its gigantism. The entire arthropod world was scaling up, and nowhere was this more dramatic than in the sky. Meet Meganeura monyi, a griffinfly, related to but distinct from modern dragonflies, with a wingspan of approximately 70 centimeters. That's about 28 inches, 2 1/3 feet of wingspan on an insect. Meganeura is often described as a giant dragonfly, and while it wasn't technically a dragonfly in the modern sense, it looked enough like one that the comparison is useful. It had the same basic body plan: elongated body, two pairs of large veined wings, large compound eyes, on one and the forward-facing legs of a predator that catches prey in flight. In modern dragonflies, this body plan makes them arguably the most efficient aerial hunters on Earth. Studies have found that dragonflies catch their target on over 95% of hunting attempts. Meganeura, scaled up to the size of a small hawk, would have been extraordinary. Its prey would have been other insects. The Carboniferous forests were full of them, as well as, possibly, small vertebrates. The early amphibians and primitive reptiles of the Carboniferous were small enough that a large Meganeura might have been able to prey on juveniles. This is speculation, but it's informed speculation. The size and presumed strength of Meganeura make it at least physically plausible. The reason insects can't get this large today is the same reason they could in the Carboniferous: oxygen. Insects breathe through a passive system of tubes called tracheae, which deliver oxygen directly to tissues without the help of a heart or lungs. This system works brilliantly at small scales and becomes increasingly inefficient at larger scales. The tubes simply can't deliver enough oxygen fast enough to support a large body. At 21% atmospheric oxygen, this limits insects to the sizes we see today. At 35% atmospheric oxygen, the efficiency improves enough to support a body the size of Meganeura. And this is one of the most elegant examples of how the physical environment doesn't just constrain life, it sculpts it. The Carboniferous atmosphere didn't just allow giant insects. It required them, in a sense, by offering a resource, all that available oxygen, that natural selection found a way to exploit. The skies of the Carboniferous were alive with giants. Meganeura was the largest, but it was not alone. Giant mayflies, giant cockroaches. Yes, see, the Carboniferous is sometimes called the age of cockroaches by entomologists, because cockroach fossils from this period are extraordinarily abundant. The forest floor and the air above it were the domain of arthropods in a way that the world has not seen since. The car-sized, creepy-crawly Arthropleura. And then there's Arthropleura, our headline giant, the creature that, if you met it on a forest path, would make every instinct in your body tell you to run. Sir Arthropleura armata was a myriapod, related to modern centipedes and millipedes, that lived during the Carboniferous between approximately 345 and 295 million years ago. The fossil evidence for its size is remarkably direct. Preserved trackways, the actual footprints left in ancient mud, over 19 inches wide, and body segment fossils that, when extrapolated to a full animal, give a maximum length of around 8.5 feet and a weight of approximately 110 pounds. 8.5 feet long, 110 pounds. An arthropod, the largest land-living invertebrate that has ever existed on this planet. The popular image of Arthropleura, the one you see in documentaries, usually filmed with a dramatic soundtrack and presented as a charging predator, is almost certainly wrong. The fossil evidence strongly suggests that Arthropleura was not a predator at all. Analysis of the few fossilized gut contents available, combined with the structure of its mouth parts, it points toward herbivory or detritivory. It was eating plants, seeds, decaying organic material, and possibly fungi. The nightmare fuel of popular culture turns out, at the level of its actual diet, to be something more like a very large, very armored vacuum cleaner for the forest floor. But peaceful herbivore does not mean unthreatening. Arthropleura would have been an impressive physical presence. Its body was protected by overlapping plates of chitin, the same material insect exoskeletons are made of, but at a scale that would make it genuinely armored. Its dozens of legs would have moved in the coordinated ripple that gives modern millipedes their characteristic motion, but at a scale that means each leg is substantial in its own right. Moving through the undergrowth of a carboniferous forest, it would have been audible. The rustle of that armored body pushing through vegetation, on the soft percussion of dozens of feet on the leaf litter. A recent discovery announced in 2021 added remarkable detail to our picture of Arthropleura. A beautifully preserved segment was found in Northumberland, England, in a piece of sandstone that had cracked open to reveal it. This specimen, dating to around 326 million years ago, is the largest Arthropleura fossil ever found, and it came from a young individual, which means the adults were even larger than this specimen suggests. And the finding also tells us something about Arthropleura's lifestyle. The sedimentary context suggests it was living near the edge of an ancient river system in an environment rich in plant debris. Not a forest interior specialist, but a riverside generalist. Why did Arthropleura eventually go extinct? The oxygen hypothesis gives us most of the answer. As the Carboniferous ended and the Permian began, the vast forest that had generated the oxygen surplus began to dry out and contract. The atmospheric oxygen level dropped back toward modern levels. The physiological advantage that had allowed arthropods to reach gigantic sizes began to disappear. Arthropleura, already at the extreme edge of what the arthropod body plan can support, had no room to adapt. The giant millipedes vanished, leaving behind only their fossilized trackways in ancient rock, and the world moved on to its next dynasty of giants. Why giants keep appearing? The science of gigantism. Before we move to the next chapter of Earth's giant story, it's worth pausing to ask a fundamental question. Why do giants keep evolving at all? Across the entire history of life on Earth, there is a consistent pattern. Again and again, in lineage after lineage, in environment after environment, evolution produces large-bodied forms, the arthropods of the Carboniferous, the synapsids of the Permian, the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic, the whales of the Cenozoic. The pattern is so consistent that it has a name, Cope's rule, after the 19th century paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, who first formally described the tendency of animal lineages to increase in body size over evolutionary time. Why? The advantages of large body size are real and well documented. Larger animals can access food sources unavailable to smaller ones. They can eat larger prey, reach higher vegetation, or exploit the energy locked in low-quality food like bark and leaves by processing larger quantities. Larger animals are harder to kill. Predators that can handle a 10-pound animal cannot necessarily handle a 100-pound one, and prey animals that reach a certain size effectively graduate out of the range of most predators. Larger animals retain heat more efficiently, giving them advantages in cold environments. Larger animals can travel farther on the same caloric budget, allowing them to exploit patchy or widely distributed resources. The disadvantages are equally real. Large animals need more food, absolutely, even if they need less food per unit of body weight. They reproduce more slowly, meaning their populations recover more slowly from environmental disruptions. They are more vulnerable to rapid environmental change precisely because their slower reproduction means they adapt more slowly, while they require larger home ranges and are therefore more exposed to habitat loss. The history of Earth's giants can be read as the history of environments where the advantages of large size temporarily outweigh the disadvantages, and then the environmental conditions change, and the giants pay the price. The Carboniferous oxygen spike explains the arthropod giants. But oxygen isn't the only driver, which there are several other well-documented mechanisms. The ecological vacuum. When a major predator or competitor goes extinct, the ecological role it filled doesn't disappear. It waits for something to fill it. The creatures that fill it often grow larger to do so because the prey base is now available to whoever can handle it. This is why the extinction events in Earth's history are often followed by explosions of new large-bodied forms. The Great Dying cleared the ecological stage when the dinosaurs moved in. The asteroid that killed the non-avian dinosaurs cleared the stage again, and the mammals, previously small and nocturnal, exploded into every large-body ecological role within 10 million years. Island gigantism and dwarfism. On islands, and in isolated ecosystems that function like islands, the normal rules of body size are often reversed. Predators, in the absence of competition, sometimes shrink. Prey species, in the absence of predators, sometimes grow enormous. The Komodo dragon is a remnant of a lineage of giant monitor lizards that once ranged across Australia. The giant tortoises of the Galapagos and Aldabra are island giants. The extinct elephant birds of Madagascar and moa of New Zealand were island giants. Isolation removes the competitive pressures that keep size in check, and body size drifts toward whatever the available food supply can support. The arms race. When predators and prey evolve in the same ecosystem over millions of years, they tend to escalate each other. Prey gets larger, harder to kill. Predators get larger, capable of killing larger prey. The prey gets larger again. This predator-prey arms race has driven some of the most dramatic examples of size increase in the fossil record, including the evolution of the largest dinosaurs, which were prey animals, and the largest predatory dinosaurs, which were chasing them. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't make the giants less impressive. If anything, it makes them more so, because it reveals that their size was not accidental. It was the product of specific environmental and ecological pressures, shaping specific lineages over millions of years, producing creatures perfectly calibrated to the world they lived in. And then, inevitably, the world changed. The saber-toothed terror in Australia. Now we move to the Permian period, roughly 299 to 252 million years ago, and we meet the first truly terrifying large-bodied land predator in Earth's history. The Permian is a world in transition. The vast coal forests of the Carboniferous have dried out. The climate is becoming more continental, more seasonal, more arid. The arthropod giants are gone. But the vertebrates, the animals with backbones, are diversifying rapidly and filling the ecological roles left open by the arthropods' retreat. And they are not dinosaurs. This is the crucial, often misunderstood point about the Permian. The dominant large-bodied animals of this period are not the ancestors of dinosaurs. They are synapsids, the group that, through a long and complex evolutionary path, would eventually give rise to the mammals. In the Permian, if before any of that mammalian future was apparent, the synapsids were already producing creatures of extraordinary size and ferocity. The gorgonopsids were the apex predators of the late Permian. They were synapsids, technically proto-mammals in the sense that they're on the evolutionary branch that leads to mammals, though they didn't look remotely mammalian. They had 4 limbs, a relatively upright posture compared to earlier, sprawling reptile-like ancestors, ran, in the largest species, skulls that were genuinely massive. Inostrancevia alexandri was the largest known gorgonopsid. It reached approximately 11.5 feet in body length, with a skull up to 2 feet long. And those teeth. The canines of Inostrancevia were genuine sabers, up to 15 centimeters, or about 6 inches, of curved, serrated killing tool. These were not just for show. The biomechanics of the gorgonopsid skull suggest a specific hunting strategy. A wide gape was used to drive the sabers into prey with the full force of the animal's neck and body weight, delivering deep puncture wounds to vital areas. Fast, powerful, and devastating. Its prey was the armor-plated Scutosaurus, a pariasaur, a large herbivorous reptile-like animal with a body built like a barrel and skin reinforced with bony scales called osteoderms. Scutosaurus could reach weights of a ton or more. Hunting it successfully required a predator of considerable size and power, exactly what Inostrancevia provided. The 2023 discovery of Inostrancevia fossils in South Africa, far from its previously known range in Russia, was one of the most remarkable paleontological stories in recent years. The implications were staggering. The local South African gorgonopsid predators had gone extinct slightly before the end Permian mass extinction, possibly due to local environmental deterioration. And Inostrancevia somehow had made the journey across the supercontinent of Pangaea to fill the vacant apex predator role, thousands of miles on foot through the late Permian landscape. How long did this migration take? Probably millions of years. Not a single heroic journey, but a gradual range expansion across generations. But the endpoint was a population of Russian gorgonopsids now living in what would become South Africa, having crossed a continent to claim a vacant ecological throne. Inostrancevia was not the apex predator of some distant, irrelevant world. It was our distant cousin, a proto-mammal, member of the lineage that would eventually produce the first true mammals, 100 million years after its own extinction. In a very real sense, looking at Inostrancevia is looking at an early draft of ourselves, a draft that the universe crumpled up and discarded, but a draft nonetheless. A world lost to fire, the great dying, and then everything ended. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying, is the single most catastrophic event in the history of complex life on Earth. It was not the largest mass extinction in absolute terms. The earlier N. Ordovician extinction may have killed a higher percentage of marine species, but the Great Dying was the deepest, most comprehensive destruction of biological diversity in the last 500 million years. It nearly, and I mean nearly, ended the entire experiment of complex multicellular life. The trigger was volcanic. Beginning around 252 million years ago, a massive volcanic system in what is now Siberia, called the Siberian Traps, began erupting on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. These weren't individual volcanoes. This was a flood basalt event, thousands of cubic miles of lava pouring out over hundreds of thousands of years, covering an area roughly the size of Europe in solidified lava up to 3 miles deep. The volcanic activity injected enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, much triggering catastrophic greenhouse warming, ocean acidification, and the collapse of the oxygen cycle in the seas. The results were apocalyptic. Global temperatures rose by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above the already warm Permian baseline. Temperatures that pushed life past its physiological limits across vast stretches of the planet. The oceans, acidified and depleted of oxygen, experienced a near-total collapse of marine ecosystems. When they estimate that 90 to 96% of all marine species went extinct is based on the fossil record. And it is, if anything, probably an underestimate of the true devastation. On land, the losses were nearly as severe. Estimates suggest that approximately 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. The gorgonopsids, every single species, including Inostrancevia, were wiped out completely. The large pariasaur herbivores vanished. The giant insects and arthropods had already declined. But any stragglers would have been finished by the changed climate. The Great Dying was not a quick event. It unfolded over tens of thousands of years, which sounds slow by human standards, but is geologically rapid. It was a sustained assault on the biosphere, wave after wave of environmental deterioration, each one knocking the survivors further back. Species that survived the initial warming were hit by ocean acidification. Species that survived that were hit by toxic gas releases. And species that survived that were hit by the collapse of the food web. What came through to the other side was the survivors. The small, the adaptable, the generalists. Tiny therapsids, proto-mammals, that could eat almost anything and live almost anywhere. Early archosaurs, the group that would give rise to both the dinosaurs and the crocodilians. Primitive turtles, early lizard-like animals. And they emerged into a Triassic world that was biologically impoverished and ecologically wide open. A devastated planet with millions of unfilled ecological niches and almost nothing to fill them. The Great Dying was the reset button. The worst catastrophe in the history of animal life was also the blank canvas on which the next great dynasty of giants would paint itself. The first giant vertebrate on land, bridging the gap. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, and the ecological stage was cleared, and the groups that survived were scrambling in evolutionary time to fill every available role. One of the most immediate evolutionary responses was, predictably, size increase. When large predators vanish, their prey can safely get larger. When large prey vanishes, predators must adapt or follow. The Triassic period, the first period after the Great Dying, is marked by rapid diversification and, in several lineages, rapid size increase. The archosaurs, which the group that includes the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodilians, took advantage of the devastated landscape most effectively. Within 10 to 20 million years of the Great Dying, archosaur lineages were producing large-bodied forms in multiple ecological roles. The Rauisuchians, large crocodile-line archosaurs, became the dominant predators of many Triassic ecosystems. The etosaurs, armored herbivores also in the crocodile line, filled large herbivore roles. And the dinosaurs themselves, emerging as a distinct group in the mid-Triassic around 243 million years ago, initially began as small bipedal animals, fast, agile, probably quick-thinking compared to their competition. The transition from small to enormous within the dinosaur lineage is one of the most dramatic size evolutionary events in the fossil record. The earliest dinosaurs were the size of dogs or large cats. Within 50 million years, a blink of geological time, their descendants included Patagotitan, a sauropod that may have weighed over 70 tons, and Tyrannosaurus rex, the most famous large predator in Earth's history. But the dinosaur story is so well documented, so well known, that it risks overshadowing something equally remarkable: the transition period itself. Between the tiny generalist survivors of the Great Dying and the full-blown age of dinosaurs lies a fascinating, messy, experimentally diverse Triassic world in which multiple different body plans were competing to define what large would mean on land. Some of those competitors were extraordinary. The phytosaur, large semi-aquatic archosaurs that looked uncannily like modern crocodilians despite being only distantly related to them, reached lengths of over 20 feet. The dicynodonts, a group of proto-mammals related to the lineage that produced Inostrancevia, bounced back surprisingly from the Great Dying and produced forms like Lysawisha, a Triassic dicynodont from Poland that reached elephant-like proportions up to 9 tons. A proto-mammal the size of an elephant, living alongside early dinosaurs. The Triassic is the world's great evolutionary free-for-all. Multiple lineages competing for the same ecological roles, producing convergent solutions to the same problems. How do you get large? How do you get fast? How do you process the massive amounts of vegetation needed to fuel a multi-ton body? The dinosaurs eventually won this competition for reasons that paleontologists are still debating. But the winning was not quick, and it was not inevitable. For tens of millions of years, the outcome hung in the balance. Into the deep. Dunkleosteus and the ocean's first great predator. We've spent most of our time on land, or close to it. But the oceans were producing giants long before the land was. And one of the most extraordinary giant predators in Earth's history lived entirely in the sea, and has a claim to the most powerful bite of any animal that has ever existed. Go back to the Devonian period, around 358 to 382 million years ago. Before the Carboniferous, before the Great Forests, before Arthropleura or Meganeura. The land is still largely bare, but the oceans are in the middle of a biological revolution, the rise of the jawed vertebrates. The first vertebrates, the first animals with backbones, were jawless filter feeders, more like oversized armored worms than anything we'd recognize as fish. The evolution of jaws was one of the most transformative events in the history of vertebrate life, because jaws enabled active predation at a scale that had never been possible before. And the first animals to take full advantage of jaws were the placoderms, armored fish whose head and thorax were encased in bony plates, connected to each other by a joint that allowed the entire front of the skull to lift upward when the lower jaw dropped. Dunkleosteus terrelli was the apex of the placoderm lineage. It was enormous. Current estimates put the largest individuals at around 20 feet in length, and possibly considerably more, although the exact size is debated because only the armored front section typically fossilizes. The rest of the body, being unarmored, usually decays without leaving a record. Some researchers have proposed maximum lengths of up to 30 feet, which would make it larger than a great white shark. But the size isn't even the most impressive thing. The bite is. The jaws of Dunkleosteus didn't have teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, the bony armor plates themselves were shaped into sharp, shearing edges, effectively self-sharpening blades that work like a pair of scissors. And the biomechanics of those jaws were extraordinary. A 2006 study analyzed the jaw mechanics of Dunkleosteus and estimated a bite force of approximately 8,000 pounds per square inch at the tips of the jaw blades, with the four self-sharpening tips exerting up to 80,000 pounds per square inch as they closed. To put this in context, a saltwater crocodile, the current record holder for bite force among living animals, produces about 3,700 pounds per square inch. A great white shark produces around 4,000. Dunkleosteus was producing bite force roughly double any living predator, enough to shear through the thick armor of other placoderms, which were themselves not small animals. A 2024 study revised our understanding of Dunkleosteus still further, suggesting that the animal was more tuna-shaped than shark-shaped, a fast, open water predator rather than the somewhat sluggish ambush predator of earlier reconstructions. If this is correct, Dunkleosteus was not just the most powerfully biting predator in ocean history. It was potentially fast enough to run down prey in open water. Fossil stomach contents and coprolites, fossilized droppings, from Dunkleosteus sites show the half-digested remains of other fish, including other placoderms. This was a predator that ate other armored giants. When in the ecosystem it inhabited, it was the undisputed apex, a position it held for tens of millions of years. The placoderms went extinct at the end of the Devonian, part of a major extinction event that cleared the ocean's ecological stage and allowed the sharks and bony fish to diversify into the roles the placoderms had vacated. Dunkleosteus and its relatives vanished, and the world has never seen their like again. The giant killers. What ends the reign of each giant? Looking across the giants we've met tonight, a pattern emerges that is both sobering and, in a strange way, beautiful. Every dynasty of giants ends, without exception, and the way each dynasty ends tells us something profound about the relationship between life and the physical environment it inhabits. Jaekelopterus and the Eurypterids were displaced by the rise of predatory fish during the Devonian. Creatures with jaws and internal skeletons that could outcompete the arthropods in the aquatic predator role. The Eurypterids didn't go extinct in a single catastrophe. They were outcompeted gradually over millions of years until the last species disappeared in the Great Dying. Meganeura and the giant carboniferous insects were killed by atmospheric change. The great coal forests that generated the oxygen surplus began to collapse as the climate dried toward the end of the Carboniferous, in an event called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. As the forests fragmented, oxygen levels dropped. The physiological advantage that had allowed giant arthropods to exist went away. The arthropod giants declined over millions of years as the atmospheric conditions that had produced them became the atmospheric conditions that could no longer support them. An Arthropleura went with the same collapse for the same reasons. The largest land invertebrate that ever lived was, ultimately, a consequence of atmospheric chemistry. And when the chemistry changed, there was nowhere for it to go. Inostrantvia and the Gorgonopsids met a different end, the most catastrophic event in the history of complex life. They didn't decline gradually. They were hit by a wall of fire and gas in acidified oceans and collapsed food webs, and they died completely. No survivors, no refugia, no remnant populations. The Great Dying was not a filter that let the most adaptable through. It was a catastrophe that killed almost everything and left survival largely to chance, to whichever lineages happened to have the right body size, the right dietary flexibility, the right reproductive rate to persist through the devastation. Dunkleosteus was ended by the late Devonian extinction, a series of extinction pulses that decimated marine life, and are particularly in shallow seas over roughly 25 million years. The exact cause or causes of the late Devonian extinction are still debated. Ocean anoxia, global cooling, possibly volcanic activity, possibly even the first land plants, whose deep root systems dramatically accelerated the weathering of rock, releasing nutrients into the oceans and potentially triggering massive algal blooms that starved the water of oxygen when they decayed. The pattern across all of these extinctions is the same. The giants were perfectly suited to the world they inhabited. They were the products of millions of years of evolution in specific physical and ecological conditions. And when those conditions changed, whether through volcanism, atmospheric chemistry, meteorite impact, or biological transformation of the environment, the giants paid the price that specialization always extracts eventually. This is not a comforting pattern if you think about it carefully, because it applies to us too. The largest-brained, most technologically sophisticated species in the history of Earth is also, right now, in the process of dramatically altering the physical and chemical conditions of the planet it inhabits. The giants of the past didn't see it coming. They couldn't. They had no capacity to observe the changing chemistry of the atmosphere, no ability to model where the trends were heading, no possibility of making different choices. We do. Whether we use that capacity is a different question. The real mythology. So, we came in looking for giants and we found them. Not the giants of the legends, not the humanoid titans of Norse and Greek and Hebrew mythology. Something stranger, something more alien, something that no culture on Earth, however imaginative, ever actually conceived of in the millennia before the fossil record was understood. A scorpion the size of a crocodile, patrolling a Devonian river. And a dragonfly with a wingspan of 2.5 feet, hunting in an oxygen-drunk sky. A millipede the length of a car, armored in chitin, moving through ancient forests that no longer exist. A saber-toothed proto-mammal, crossing a supercontinent to claim an empty throne. A fish with the bite force of an industrial press, shearing through armored prey in a Devonian sea. These are the real myths. And not myths in the sense of being false, in the sense of being the stories that a world tells about itself through the evidence it leaves in stone. Every fossil is a word in that story. Every extinct giant is a chapter. And the story, read in its entirety, is not a comforting one. It is a story of extraordinary life, rising and flourishing and dominating, and then vanishing. Sometimes gradually, sometimes with terrifying abruptness, as the world it was built for ceased to exist. But it is also a story of survival, of the small, the adaptable, the overlooked, clinging on through catastrophe and emerging on the other side to inherit the world. The therapsid survivors of the great dying that became the first true mammals. The tiny feathered dinosaurs that survived the asteroid to become today's birds. The small jawless fish of the Cambrian that eventually produced every vertebrate that has ever lived, including the one watching this video right now. The myths got the giants wrong, but they got something right. The intuition that the world was not always as it is now, that the past was larger, stranger, more violent, and more astonishing than the present, that there were forms of life that operated at a scale we can barely imagine. They were right about that. They just had no idea how right. We've been underground and underwater for over 500 million years tonight, and we barely scratched the surface. The ocean giants alone could fill another full video, not just Dunkleosteus, but Leopleurodon, The Jurassic marine reptile with flippers longer than a car. Basilosaurus, the 60-foot Eocene whale that looked nothing like a modern whale and may have hunted other whales. Megalodon, the shark that needs no introduction and gets more than enough attention already, but whose story, told honestly, is stranger than the movies suggest. If you want that video, The Titans of the Ancient Sea, it in full, comment ocean giants below. And if tonight gave you a new appreciation for just how alien Earth's own history is, how the world you're sitting in right now is built on the ruins of at least 5 or 6 completely different versions of the planet, each one dominated by creatures that no longer exist, hit the like button. It's the simplest way to tell me this is the kind of deep dive worth doing. Subscribe for more. The fossil record has barely been opened. And here is the thing about myths. They aren't wrong because the people who made them were stupid. They're wrong because the people who made them were working with incomplete information, doing the best interpretation they could with the evidence available. They saw bones in the ground and they made stories. They felt the presence of deep time, the intuition that the world had a history longer and stranger than living memory could contain. And they found the best language available to them to describe that intuition. That language was mythology, giants, titans, primordial monsters. We have better language now. We have fossils and radiometric dating and electron microscopes and genomic sequencing. We have the ability to look at a piece of rock and read, from its chemistry, with a composition of an atmosphere that hasn't existed for 300 million years. We have the ability to reconstruct, from a single fossilized claw, the body of an 8-foot scorpion that hunted in a Devonian river. Our myths are more accurate than theirs, but they're still myths, still stories we tell about what the evidence means, still interpretations that future generations will revise and improve. The fossil record is incomplete. The models we build from it are our best current understanding. It is not final truth. The giants we met tonight were real. The world they lived in was real. The story of how they rose and how they fell is, as best we can determine, true. And somewhere in the rock beneath your feet, in the sedimentary layers that have been accumulating since before complex life existed, there are chapters of that story we haven't read yet. Giant creatures perfectly preserved, waiting for the right rock to crack at the right angle, for the right scientist to be walking past at the right moment. The story isn't finished, it's just waiting.